The third commandment: You shall not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold guiltless whoever takes his name in vain. The interpretation that Dennis Prager offers is one in which the greatest form of evil is where you corrupt the thing which is good, where you're trying to corrupt the people who are leading people towards more ethical lives, demonstrating ethical action, and institutions which are supposed to lead people towards more moral lives and better ethical action, decision making in their lives. So ultimately, the framework within the Judeo-Christian tradition is going to be that, you know, if you're Jewish, it's the synagogue; if you're Christian, it's the church, and then the teachings, ultimately encapsulated in the Ten Commandments and the life of Moses and so on, and likewise the life of Christ and so on, and Christ's own commandments to love. To corrupt these things from the inside is the greatest evil, and it's that which is the highest thing, which is so despicable that not even God will forgive the people who deprive people of good moral instruction and thus make the world a much more terrible place. Now, in the inversion of that, we see that you shall not bear the name of the species being in vain, for the socialist will not hold guiltless whoever takes its name in vain. And in order to make sense of this, it's perhaps good to just take a step back and have a look at what we've already explored in the past 3 videos. So we understand that when you come to whether it's the Hegelian or even the Marxist tradition, there's now the dialectical form of logic and then the process of historicism which advanced towards a known end in history. And with this you have a new form of logic, and then B, a whole load of new semantic concepts and categories which take place alongside this new dialectical methodology. So you've got your intellect, nous, and then you have the essentially what becomes a Gnostic revelation. You can come to know something absolutely through this dialectic. That's why when Hegel says, you know, what is reasonable is real. So if you can have it in your consciousness, then to some degree it is real, or it is real. Obviously, you can argue against that, because even if something occurs in your consciousness, you know, we have people who happen to have mental illnesses. We have a lot of error in the way that we apprehend the world. Sometimes our reactions or thoughts on something, you know, don't have the whole picture. So there's a huge number of ways in which what we really think about things is, in a sense, not real or less than what it really is, and that's why you have the process of investigation. But if you're not elucidating that it's incumbent on the person to investigate and to obviously, you know, have some restraint on your emotions so you don't act ridiculously in reaction to something, then you're not going to have access to controlling your emotions and your understanding of the world, and then not allow it to have a bearing and forcing you to act out in a negative way. So the revelation ultimately in the Marxist system is self-pursued, and the person opts into the revolutionary collective, as we've seen, and that collective is maintained with, now that they're out with the vertical covenant with God, they only have the horizontal covenant of or social contract, I should say. And the point is that once you've got the dialectical methodology as the governing mode of thought, the new form of logic, which generates the concept whereby you then take what's in consciousness, what's reasoned, what is real, but then translate it into something which actually occurs concretely in the material world, then you've got this process of moving from, you know, dialectical cognition into dialectical action. And the ultimate thing is to ensure that everybody's always having their alignment on their consciousness, so they can all comprehend what is reasonable and that which is real, so that they're all putting it into action. There's got to be harmony between them all. Now, this means that everybody has to be open to the process of consistently having revelations to reform their consciousness, which in turn reform their action. And indeed, the entire apocrypha of leftist academia is constantly in pursuit of generating revelatory experiences or insights into the mundane, in order to say, okay, well, there's this aspect of reality which we didn't understand and then didn't reform, so we need to integrate this into the revolutionary movement. And essentially, a crude rule of thumb is to just take everything which is understood to be natural or which is favoured by even evolution, the way that you perhaps want to have a society structured and organised for the best outcomes, take every single aspect and simply invert it. And those will be the kinds of conclusions that will be arrived at in the revelatory tradition of leftist dialectical thinking. Of course, it's incumbent on the person to spread it through missionary work, and on the first instance that can be you share it by word of mouth to other people. More broadly though, propaganda, censorship, these are important things. You censor, so you negate the thing that you dislike, and you propagandize for the thing that you want to posit, the way you in alignment with what you want people to behave. And likewise, these broad intellectual traditions with people just going through revelations, well, that is part of the missionary work. So if somebody comes in and pays for a university course on gender studies, critical animal studies, critical child innocence studies, or whatever it happens to be, whatever is in the dialectical, under the dialectical eye and what's popular at the time, those people will come in, they'll be paying money in order to have their own mind populated by the dialectical method to reform their cognition, metacognition, cognition, so on and so forth, and then send them out into the world as revolutionaries. So the missionary work is, it's a trade, it's in the institutions, and then the person themselves likewise becomes a missionary, but they need the missionary material in order to go out and raise people's consciousness through the process of dialectical revelation. And so you've got this distinction which always occurs between those who are in the know and those who sustain the false reality. So you've essentially kind of, with the dialectical method, you've got this process of a conscious Darwinism of politics where you're deliberately evolving, you're trying to consciously evolve the ground and understanding of the world in order that you can unseat and destabilize the people who you dislike, and then thereby negate them. Of course, when you do this, you create a contradiction, and within the framework where you're ultimately working towards everything being the monad at the end, where everything's in a kind of harmony and self-reflective understanding which is unmediated with anything which is not itself, then you're going to need to get rid of the contradiction. So there's this supersession which needs to occur, whether it's of physical material being, whether it's the understanding and ideas and concepts that people use, then ultimately right down to the people themselves, which is obviously why in Soviet Russia and Maoist China under the Khmer Rouge and so on and so forth, that academics in particular were always targeted because they've got the wrong consciousness, they're leading people to the wrong understanding of the world, they're sustaining false reality, so on and so forth. So you need to either take them to a camp, use their slave labor as part of the process of revealing to themselves the horrors of their own system, and then to use this, turning this back on themselves to reform their consciousness so that they'll either join the revolution or ultimately they die in the process. Either way, it's win-win for the revolutionaries and the Gnostic mystics. These kinds of lines of thought about Gnosticism, you can see a lot more in James Lindsay's work, who I'd also recommend that you go and check out. Now, more directly, when we're coming to not taking the Lord thy God in vain, and not holding guiltless whoever does so, you're coming at this from the inverse of where you'd normally expect it. So typically this would be that you don't do evil in God's name, you don't claim God as evil, whereas in this side you're obviously looking at things from the opposite. So it's going to be that Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, its morals, they were the thing which was taking the real God's name in vain, and the real God, of course, in this system is humanity. So the intent within the dialectical methodology is you take the thing that you want to, you take the things as they are. You've obviously got where you want to get to, so you then back populate the antithesis that you want to generate in order to get where you want. So this is why you supersede Catholicism or Christianity, Judeo-Christian tradition more broadly, by negating with it with its total opposite, i.e. the inversion. So you've got Marx, who has all of his poetry, which is like suicide pacts. Even in love, couples have some sort of horrendous tragedy kind of aspect to their being and lives. the Haraway's kind of faith through blasphemy, the ironic faith, and yeah, there's plenty of reference to the devil or Satan explicitly in Marx's own work. He states it openly himself. With the devil I've struck my deal, or he's plunging his black sword into the soul. So you can go and find that yourself. It's all out there. And in Marx's system, atheism is simply a prelude. So atheism is part of the aspect of negating God directly, but it's necessary for the second stage, the later positive stage of socialism to occur, in which there's self-deification, that people realise that humanity bonded with nature as this monad is the new form of divinity. So you've got the problem, at least as the Marxists are coming at it from, is that God is an image before man. So you've got to raise the correct image. God does not exist. Humanity must free itself. So here you're then going to have the existing moral order is the inversion of what it ought to be. It is evil. You've got the negation of it, and then you've got to posit the new moral order. And indeed, when the pantheist monad is established, this Eurobric entity by itself takes from itself in order to refashion the species and being for itself. So you've got this internal entity where humanity is part of nature. Humanity takes nature and then reforms it into material objects for its lives, whether it's houses or whatever. Animal husbandry, so you can train animals and domesticate them, and you obviously cull them if there's unhealthy ones, and you eat the healthy ones. And then likewise you can turn this refashioning process back onto humans themselves, so that no different really from if you were wanting to overcome a bad habit or to cultivate a skill. You're in a sense, through a certain lens, you're overcoming your old self, and you're refashioning yourself as to be kind of like an apprentice, a journeyman, a master, and an artisan in a certain skill. So of course, when it comes to the pantheist monad, you've then got all the social relations which manifest the actual connections between and within this divinity. So your production is one of the expressions of essentially the pantheist god regenerating and transforming the world and being. And then likewise you have the social relations, through which you've got all the different lenses which collectively looking at the at what has taken place, and collectively looking back at yourself as a facet of one particular extension of the pantheist universality. You can see yourself in this divine structure, in this divine entity, top vertically, how you are integrated into society, the collective, the wider institutions in whether it's the political or the species means of organizing society. And then likewise you can see your relation to others, and so you can kind of see yourself and someone else. You'd be looking at each other as different aspects of the divine ideally, and you're obviously working together to self-generate. You've got different perspectives, but filtering these back into the collective is meant to update the collective on a certain level. And I mean, you can kind of see where they're roughly coming from at a certain level of abstraction, that what is within what every individual knows ultimately is somewhere there in the collective, but it's just wrong. I can go out and find some knowledge that somebody else has, but I don't necessarily possess it at that instant. And of course that's why you've always got to have this revelatory experience, in which you need to be able to consistently update to find yourself in alignment with what is oriented towards the sustaining and the generation of that pantheist god. Because if you're not, then you're doing the greatest evil. You're preventing that divinity to realizing itself through you as an individual, and you're obstructing both the ideas in consciousness and the things that you do materially in terms of your action, which thereby generate that divinity. So now we can probably, with that prelude, it's now easier to go into this section, which is, taking the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So of course we're going to be looking at the inverse. So Marx and Engels say that all religions which have existed hitherto were expressions of historical stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples. But communism is that stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and supersedes them. Again, that's one of the extracts from the Communist Confession of Faith. So what we're saying, or what Marx and Engels are saying rather, is that you have different people who are all disparate, and there's this intrinsic aspect, or this essence of people, where they're trying to get back to the divinity which is being split out and diversified among them, and it finds all these different expressions. But what's being alluded to is that those are all particular expressions of something which is universal. But unlike the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, in which God is originary and creation flows from it, you've got this system which is generative, and you're actually trying to constitute the God. So in Hegel, ultimately, you constitute God in consciousness and rescue him in philosophy, and then sustain him there. Whereas in Marx's materialization, you've got it through the material world. So you come to consciousness first, but you've got to put it into action. So once you're aware through the Hegelian system that there is obviously a means of constituting a form of divinity in philosophy, you then take this and you negate it, materialize it, and then put it into practice. So ultimately, communism is the stage of human historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and supersedes them. So what it needs to do is to, like I say, with the logic, you reduce out all the contradictions. So you've got diversity. What you then want to do is suppress all the various, or you map out all the different contradictions. But then what you're going to do is to impose a type of equity. You're going to remove the hierarchies of different social relations in existing societies, and the distinction between God and man, for example, is one kind of transcendent hierarchy. You get rid of all of these, you have an equity, and then once you've got this basically disk of everything flattened out, you then begin to roll it and fold it back in on itself, so it's dialectically shifting. And in this process, you make all of the existing religions essentially superfluous. So you go from all of the particularities and you move to the universal, and having grasped the universal in consciousness and then practicing it, there's no need for any of the particularities anymore. There's no need for example, Jainism or Buddhism or Christianity or Islam or even paganism. You get rid of all of these things. But of course, ultimately, it's going back to this integrative universals, all universals aligned with one another. So, of course, when we come to the understanding that this is the direction in which Marx wants to take us, you then have later people start to come across his ideas and correctly, I would say, explain or position themselves in orientation to the moral order as it is. So Catholicism, Lenin says, is a socially organized experience, only it reflects not objective truth, but the exploitation of the ignorance of the masses by definite social classes. So here again we see that Catholicism is the inverse. And what it's doing is it's organizing people, their experiences, their consciousness of divinity, but it's reflecting the false form. So it's reflecting one of these erroneous particulars which has popped up in the Middle East and has spiraled out across the Western world. Now the idea is that instead of it actually being a genuine apprehension of divinity in the correct system there, it's actually just an exploitation. It's this evil which needs to be overcome. And then you have Gramsci say, socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. Religion in the sense that it too is a faith with its mystics and rituals. Religion because it has substituted for the consciousness of the transcendental God of the Catholics, the faith in man and his great strength as a unique spiritual reality. So, like I say, you collapse the distinction between transcendent, Gramsci saying himself. And then he further says that the position of the philosophy of praxis is the antithesis of the Catholic. So together it's those two statements that inspired me to do this series. Those are from Gramsci, not from me, and that's why I understand that and there's a sense in which this can be comparative, and it's just okay, well, is there actually any proper substance to doing this comparison? And I would argue that this would demonstrate that yes, there is. And if you take the model of inverting Catholicism and then using that against Catholicism in order to realize the pantheist system, then you've got your Marxist model right there. In fact, you've got your level, your model, which is at the bedrock of pretty much all leftist philosophy for a good number of years. Now, the philosophy of praxis, just to make a note on it, is Gramsci's dialectical reformation of Marx's original system. So Labriola in 1896 makes a critique of Marxist, which is that the dialectical method is a totalizing method. It's all of reality that needs to be brought from its particulars and the universe up to the universals to unite the universals, and then you have the monad. Now, the criticism that Labriola makes is that the focus on the economic, whilst it is very important because ultimately that is the domain of moral instruction and moral practice and where the social contract is manifested and where material production takes place, so it's critically important in the Marxist system. There is also the issue of the existing knowledge, the existing culture, the existing practices that people have, the ability for people to think independently, and so on and so forth, that need to be overcome. So the philosophy of praxis is Gramsci's reformation of Marx's original system. He's taking Labriola's criticism, acting on it. So he says, okay, well, we need to do X, Y, and Z instead. If you go to Gramsci, then you've got the bedrock of the post-structuralist movement. So you've got statements about the language that people use. So this would really parse out into Derrida and Foucault. And then you've also got quite an extensive examination and writing around educational institutions. And so whereas Marx and Engels essentially come to the methodology through Hegel's philosophy and then start to do their own developments, they think that once the revelation's brought to everyone, once the Promethean spark is ignited in people's consciousness and they're self-enlightened, then they'll opt into the system and they'll become part of the revolution. Whereas obviously that didn't happen. Gramsci's argument therefore is that instead of having two intellectuals who come up with the majority of the system, now everybody must be capable of embodying the dialectical process and the means of thought and the concepts and so on and so forth. So you need to get rid of common sense. He explicitly says that. You need to get rid of Catholicism. Obviously here that's important because that's an institution which is teaching morality and which is obviously explicitly the opposite of what Marxism is. But the interesting thing about this is that once you realize that it's the Marxism is the inversion of Catholicism, then you've got these you can have these funny little antinomies that you often find in the Hegelian literature, which is, to ascend is to descend. So of course, if you're looking at it from the Christian perspective, to ascend in the Marxist system is to really descend in terms of your moral character and the way you're conducting themselves in the world. Whereas the Marxist would look at it the complete opposite. So if you ascend in virtue, conducting yourself in alignment with the commandments and obtaining God's grace and God working through you to make the world a better place, then in their system you're actually descending. Now, of course, once we've got Marxist system, humanity generates both being itself, and as part of itself it can reform its own morality. So Marx states in the fourth thesis on Feuerbach, the materialist doctrine concerning the changing of circumstances and upbringing forgets that circumstances are changed by men and that the educator must himself be educated. This doctrine must, therefore, divide society into two parts, one of which is superior to society, the coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-change can be conceived and rationally understood only as a revolutionary practice. So fundamentally, right at the core, you need to be bringing the system of logic and the concepts which are thereby associated with it, which are themselves antithetical to the present understanding of the world, of humanity, of being, of morality, upright conduct, and so on and so forth, and people must be educated into it. Educated is a very, that's kind of almost like a marketing in the 1840s term, because later on Marx goes on to explain that propaganda is the first end of the people. So you propagandize. Of course, for propaganda to be successful, you actually need censorship, because censorship disrupts prevents the disruption of the propaganda. So you censor the things that you dislike, you negate them, you promote the things you do like, the propaganda, and then primarily you go through education. So Marx and Engels were massive advocates of state education, because once leftists could get into the educational system and set the curricula, set the contents, then they realized that this would help to teach people the right way of thinking, to have be amenable to the revelations of the collective. So, of course, socialism, man's positive self-consciousness. So just to recall, socialism in Marx's system is not the way we would normally understand it, about just taking material possessions and making them more collectively owned or utilized. It's really about a certain form of consciousness which is aware that it has collapsed the distinction between God and man, and likewise has collapsed the distinction between monarch and man. And it's specifically when he's rejecting Hegel's system of dialectical monarchy that Marx is obviously positioning this, so that socialism is man's positive self-consciousness. So that's the consciousness which posits, so it's already gone through the negation of Christianity and Catholicism, and it can now posit its new morals. It can posit its new sense of being, and it can go and reform reality. That's why he says positive self-consciousness has the same right as has the German king. And the important dialectical union to recognize there is that in Marx's system, you unite together Rousseau with Hegel dialectically. So the king, the monarch, becomes the collective, most represented by the party. And you can kind of pit this, you can pit this explicitly against Giovanni Gentili's neo-Hegelian system of Italian fascism and the role and relation of Il Duce, Mussolini, to the Italian fascist collective. And there are significant parallels in terms of the way they conceptualize things, because as far as Marx was concerned, communism could come to be and socialism could come to be and be expressed as a dictatorship. He says that explicitly himself. So there are significant parallels between the two. Continuing on this line of thought, of course, you need to negate the old form of morality and then posit the new form of reality. Socialism is the consciousness of this process, but likewise the consciousness of the divinity, which is latent within the species being. And Marx goes on to say that good and evil are expressed through an actual economic fact. So when something is taking place in terms of social relations around material production, the material production itself, these are the actualizing the various material potential of the world and all of the kind of different potentials in consciousness that the collective have. So you're going, it's through the material action, particularly productive action, which is essentially the new form of good. Now, if it's taking place under a false understanding of reality, where there's God and so on and so forth, under an old moral system, then you're essentially taking the species being name in vain. You are doing things which are falsely informed, you're exploitative, you're using labour, you've got private property, so on and so forth, false understanding of reality, and this false understanding of reality cascades through everything. It permeates every aspect of everything, and in doing so, it induces people to maintain themselves in unconsciousness and thereby conduct evil action. That's why you can have private property and labor. That's why there's that's why there's the sacrifice of other people. And of course, you can come back to Christ's teaching, which is ultimately to self-sacrifice. If you self-sacrifice your covetous desires, I sacrifice my covetous desires, then we give to one another in charity. Whereas here you actually have, you've got multiple inversions of that, one of them thereby being that charity is actually something cruel. But likewise, you've also got then the dialectical supersession of different people. So that means that you sacrifice other people in order to come to this hypothetical world in which nobody actually sacrifices one another. So you're trying to use the opposite to create the thing. So it's no surprise, of course, that if you start from the premise of destroying people in order to try and create a more peaceful society, that you never actually lead and create a peaceful society. So the form of logic at the fundamental level is actually opposed to the aims that it states it has. That's why it's never going to realise, the the marketing, propagandistic aims and outward statement and outward appearance of the movement, rather than what it actually is, which is, as we've discussed. So when it comes to the economic aspect, of course, any kind of inequality is basically taken as evidence of evil. And that's because if there is private property, then there must have been labour, and if labour has taken place, then therefore there must have been alienation of consciousness in God, and there must have been material estrangement in order to see the object, and thereby other people and their material relations to the object as distinct from your own. So you need to overcome that with the revelatory experience. You need the knowledge, spelt with a G here, the Gnostic, obtained through the dialectical materialism and the historicism in the system. So you therefore make it real, and that takes place through revolutionary praxis. And of course, if nobody accepts the precepts laid down by Marx and his ideas, then they themselves are the one who are apparently provoking the violent revolution. So of course, there again, if you don't accept what I say, then it's your fault that I'm going to kill you and force you to do it. Of course, we've also got Sartre say something similar along the lines, which is that man makes himself, he is not found ready-made. He makes himself by the choice of his morality, and he cannot but choose a morality. Such is the pressure of circumstances upon him. And what that means is that you've got a set of material conditions, a set of material relations. These are reflected into you as an individual. You as an individual are likewise a reflection of the collective, and likewise you have your own consciousness. So you've got the material relations reflected up into the way that you engage with the collective, and you've got the reflection of the material relations up into your consciousness, and hence the ideas that you have, hence the morality that you have, hence the political system, the institutions that are built, so on and so forth. Sartre stating that you can just come up with new morals. There's an interesting collapse that kind of occurs here, because you can also go to someone else who's made similar arguments, such as Nietzsche, which is, with the death of God, there's the requirement in Zarathustra, he states, to make new tables, tables being the laws, the Ten Commandments. So you replace the old Ten Commandments with the new commandments, and so there's very subtle ways in which you can get very complementary positions between the way that Marxists and Nietzscheans think, because ultimately they're coming from the same position, which is the negation of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they tend to come up with, whilst there are stark differences in the system, there are places of very subtle commonality, which is incidentally why most of the post-structuralists have managed to successfully integrate Nietzsche into later dialectical movements of Marxism, because the Marxist aspect is so rigidly focused on the collective aspect that you need something which comes in and addresses the more individualist aspect to rescue the individualist aspect into social contract more broadly for knowledge, culture, the way people speak and express themselves, what's deemed right or wrong, the morality, and so on and so forth, thereby obviously creating that split. You educate people to create that split, and then the society wars with itself. The revolutionary, the subaltern, the proletariat, they destroy the old system, the bourgeoisie, and then supersede both the society, the forms of knowledge, the forms of language, the types of ideas that are shared, the types of political organisation, the way that laws are made, so on and so forth. So it just spirals off and it just keeps going. Now, likewise, there's a purpose to the morality. So of course you've got historicism, at least in the Marxist and the Gramscian. There's not historicism to a known end in Horkheimer and Adorno's Frankfurt neo-Marxism, but a caveat that can be added to that is that once you recognise all contradictions are collapsed, you have not only the process of becoming, but the become state are also united as one. So whilst Horkheimer and Adorno negate the old system, they say, okay, well, you can't have defined known end that you're wanting to move to. Instead, you just have to negate the past. Ultimately, they are actually still incredibly close to the original Marxist tradition, in that once you step into communism, you've still got the whole construction of consciousness of socialism that needs to take place. You need to still constitute full awareness across the globe of the divinity of humanity and nature, of species being. Now, when it's in Horkheimer and Adorno's system, you've almost gone through one revolution, and then you've got to come to a new awareness. It's like, okay, well, we need to start building consciousness, and that's going to involve culture and the ideas that people are taught, and the sciences and all of these different things which need to be integrated. So they don't necessarily know what the end state's going to look like, and that I think probably makes more sense, because if you really see yourself as one of the the tentacles or extensions of divinity, then why would you be delimiting yourself as a aspect of the divine as to what ought to be created? You ultimately at the bottom, if it's social contracts and the reformation of consciousness and the selection of morals, why would you be delimiting yourself and preventing a certain form of creation taking place? You don't know what tool to hand you're going to need in order to go through what experience or social organization that you desire. So it makes a lot of sense that really it's just getting past that and then coming to the realization is, well, we don't know what exactly the revolution is going to need, so we just remap reality consistently, break it, and then just dialectically continue. So it's not focusing so much on a defined end state such as communism is this isolated thing that we must get into through dialectical materialism. It's that this has taken place, and now having already gone through that, we are reforming our consciousness. We take everything and anything that we happen to need, and we're in this process of negating the past. The real become state is the becoming, and if you've got their concepts and their understanding of the world, it makes complete sense. You shouldn't be restricted by the system of Marx. The revolution must continue. So Marx has got it baked into a system that even his own ideas must be dialectically reformed and overcome. Okay, so the morality ultimately is the revolutionary practice itself. It's the overcoming the false system, bringing in the new. So Dodd, who's a very important person if you want to read, she's got an excellent book called The School of Darkness, in which she outlines her fall away from originally Catholicism, but then how communists recruit people into the communist system, which is essentially by taking particular issues and saying, okay, yes, you're for the victims, yes, you're for the suffering, do this advocacy for them, but you're not particularly clear on the connection of the particular to a set of other particulars, or even to some of the universals within the system. That we can already see from the differences between economic philosophic manuscripts in 1844 to the Communist Confession of Faith, and then lastly to the Communist Manifesto. So you've never got full awareness, because there's always that distinction between laity and the Marxist clergy. Okay, so Dodd states, citing Lenin, all our morality is entirely subordinated to the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat. That quote itself that she was referencing, Lenin states, we say morality is what serves to destroy the old exploiting society and to unite all the working people around the proletariat, which is building up a new communist society. So again, it's goal-oriented. Ultimately, the ends justify the means. We've got this system where we think, we're going to be able to bring in some new age, and whatever needs to be done in order to make that happen is acceptable. Okay, so that's it. So there's not going to be any inherent worth for the people in the movement, because they are ultimately expendable. If the movement requires that they die, then they die. If the future isn't theirs to have, judged by somebody, then so be it. That this is the way the system works. So to a communist, all morality lies in this united discipline and conscious mass struggle against the exploiters. We do not believe in an internal morality, and we expose the falseness of all the fables about morality. Morality serves the purpose of helping human society rise to a higher level and rid itself of the exploitation of labour. So again, the it positions itself as against victims, against people who exert themselves against victims. So of course, everybody's going to look at somebody who is harming somebody else needlessly or exploiting them and say, okay, well, that's cruel. You shouldn't be doing that. Kind of have more self-restraint and control over yourself. Try and be a more moral and better version of yourself rather than harming those, particularly those who are weak. Reveals a substantial amount about a person's character if they harm people who are weak or people who can't defend themselves. So there's that kind of good aspect, but which is corrupted, and it's done so in the sense that you find the people who you wish to label as the exploiters through this process of revelation. You also have no ultimate self-restraint on yourself because there's no eternal morality, so you create your own revelations about the world, and you say your morality is about making sure that these things that you've come up with in consciousness are then implemented in society, irrespective of the consequences. But to get around the violence and the imposition and the force that comes with that, you state that you're actually doing this for their good. You're raising society to a higher level. You've come up with a special insight, and everyone else needs to basically fall in line to the tune that you're playing. Now, of course, Dodd then also says in her statements, her testimony before the House of Un-American Activities, like loads and loads of files there, which are very interesting to read, and there's obviously a number of key figures. I'd like to go and expand on some of those at a later date, but Dodd states that there is only one academic freedom to them, that is loyalty to the Communist Party. There is no room for a difference of opinion. Of course, you can't have a difference of opinion because you can't have contradictions, and you can't have contradictions because thereby the revolutionary practice and morality would be pulling in different directions, and of course ultimately you'd be splitting off into essentially diversity, whereas we know that the object is to go in the opposite direction towards unity. So Dodd states that the communists are not adverse to putting on the cloak of anti-communism if it serves the purposes of promoting the party line. And then Hyde goes on to say, who's also a communist, but then who also defected. In Hungary in 1947, the communists, wishing to break the resistance of the spread of their doctrine on the part of the Catholic peasantry, raised teams of volunteers to go out into the countryside each weekend repairing war-damaged Catholic churches. Communist leaders appeared in the churches when the job was done and were often garlanded by grateful congregations. Having thus won the Catholic support and admiration, they were free to seize power, which they did, and within a few months the persecution of the church began. So what Dodd and Hyde, as former communists, are saying, and we can see this is in complete alignment with the statements of whether it's Marx or Engels or Lenin, is that if it realizes the revolution through revolutionary practice, then it is good. And ultimately that can mean that if you need to lie in order to realize the revolution, then that's fine. Here it manifests itself as communists can organize themselves to go out and help the very people they wish to destroy, because ultimately gaining their trust is more important and a more effective means of obtaining power, and in order to be able to obtain power, then to exercise that power on people. So of course, if people are trusting, if people are naive because they don't understand the Marxist tradition and their morals, realizing that essentially everything is hell-bent on destroying them, the person is so bent on destroying them that they will portray themselves as a friend. They will do acts of kindness. They will fight against and denounce other communists in order for you to believe that they are actually anti-communists. So it's really any kind of means is justified by the revolutionary end, and it's only going to be over a number of interactions that you're going to be able to understand whether an individual is kind of going more through this aspect of sacrificing other people's, or genuinely practicing a Christian self-sacrifice and, trying to mitigate and reduce and eliminate the sins. So ultimately we come to the logical conclusion of everything that we've been stating so far, and that's what, probably a slightly longer video than I was expecting to do, but the exposition of the different the different ideas which are backed up into this, the preamble, and then the unfurling of the actual moral system itself, or the principles which govern the moral system, it's very logical at this point to then say that to have done good in the name of God is to have done evil in the name of the species being. We understand why. So Hyde goes on to state that it is the exact opposite of that of Christianity. Of course, we can see how Gramsci says precisely the same. So these are Gramsci obviously being committed socialist until the end of his days, I mean socialist in the Marxist sense, and then Hyde, of course, being a former socialist, but having repudiated it eventually, and then using his inside knowledge to warn people about the threat of communism and Marxism. So ultimately, yes, when it's the exact opposite of Christianity, we can see the antithetical nature, why the morals are the opposite. Communist teachings on questions of ethics and principles are actively evil. Of course, you can't just hope that people are going to start murdering people around them. You've got to give them a framework which is thereby going to make that acceptable. So yeah, you need to delude people. You need to essentially do the opposite. So if you're a Marxist, you'll say that everyone else is in a false reality, and that you're freeing them. The persecution that you're doing to them is part of that process of freeing, and for those who remain as counter-revolutionaries and who can't be freed from their erroneous thoughts and practices, they need to be destroyed. That's just part of it. But of course, when you're coming at it from what the actual behaviours themselves are doing, the actual cost, the immense cruelties that Marxist dialectical materialism, leftism have exerted on people, these should be evidence enough that it's actively evil. The fact that wherever it's tried cross-culturally, it manifests in the same fashion is evidence enough. The problem we have in the modern day is the making some of these aspects more subtle. So you really gear up the victim aspect, and instead of going for revolutionary violence, you say, are you on the side of the victims or not? And then get people to buy into the side of people who are apparently victims, or who are taught that they're victims, who are propagandizing with their victimhood, who are using victimhood as the excuse to implement political changes, and but ultimately who are going to use it as a crutch to then go and move into self-defense, and it's through victimhood, self-defense, you get to violence ultimately again in the end. That's why our culture is in such tumult. Marx then states, indignation is the governing passion which is expressed through denunciation. So again, the revelation comes in, and then you denounce reality and all the wrong people, and you get this all across, with the communists and their types. They denounce one another, and then there's like the Duclos letter, for example, with the American Communist Party, the Trotsky and the rivalry with Stalin and Lenin. All of these, there's even been ones in the past with was it Kanshai Shek or something like this in China with Mao. There's been a whole bunch of examples, so that's normal. And the revolutionary class must fight in the name of the universal rights of society. So, whilst at a fundamental level, the proletariat must destroy the bourgeoisie and themselves and reform all of the species and being, which may demand an incredible amount of violence and blood, whilst this is being done, it needs to be done in the name of the universal rights of society. So the universal rights of society is obviously going to be saying that ultimately we're doing this for the good. That's a very kind of direct level of looking at that statement. Also, you can look at the same statement through that lens of particulars and universals, and also you can understand that you've got particulars and universals applied to the terms of, say, for example, society. So universal rights would be, you've got some of the particular aspects of the way that communists and dialectical materialists must manifest themselves, but there's a universal right, and ultimately the universal right at the root of things is the socialism. It's the consciousness of the monadic unity of species being, and the ability for this Eurobric entity to take from itself, reform itself, change its consciousness to do ultimately as it wills, because, as a collective, people can move mountains and so on and so forth. They can build incredible things, and that is almost, if you're trying to look at it from like a sandbox perspective, it would be a little bit like some sort of divine entity, or in being, reforming itself. But at the same time, whilst they're advocating that they're going to be ultimately for the victims, against the oppressors, doing the good, the universal right comes to be essentially attached to the Marxist system. So in order to be for universal rights, you will need to be a dialectical materialist. You will need to be conducting yourself in a certain way. You'll need to be bought into the social contract, have the revelations, have the later revelations. Socialism is you being bought into that revelatory process and its ongoing nature, and then being materially manifested through material production. The social relations being important because revelations can take place at different aspects in society and different places. That's something, a thesis that Gramsci fundamentally develops. But you can then get to the aspects of society. And society, of course, if we're understanding that with the dialectical materialism, you've essentially got two parallel lexicons. You see this really significantly in Derrida. In fact, it's the bedrock of his whole philosophy. Ultimately, he gets that from Horkheimer and Adorno and Gramsci, or which one of them I'm not quite certain, because they've both got theses on the way that language is used. But you can say that, okay, you've got society in the way that you would understand it, and then you've got society which is through the dialectical materialist lens. Society as we would understand it would of course be the false form of society, with the false morals, the false understanding of the relations between people. Essentially, Catholicism, that's the wrong society, whereas the new society at first is antithetical to the Catholic. So you generate a society which is oppositional in every aspect and self-conception and means in which it conducts itself. That destroys the Catholic society, the former Western society. These two together, having ripped one another to shreds and destroying one another, supersede, and then what is left is the new society. So you're using victimhood first to justify destroying people, and then you're using so that's a kind of what appears as a universal right, but ultimately the universal right being got at is the synthetic universal right of socialism, which is to reform morality and all of being and the species. So there you go. That's something subtle, which is in just a couple words there. So Marx goes on to say consistently with this that the nation must be taught to be terrified of itself. So exactly, all of the understanding that you have is so evil, you've been buying into this unconsciously, but to continue conducting yourself in the way that you're conducting yourself, look at all of these horrors, you're responsible for it, you must join the movement because this is the only way of overcoming it, and if you resist, then we will forcibly make you either join the movement or you will be killed in the revolutionary world storm. So you use terror to induce people into the right conduct. It's not by love, it's not by emulating people who've done something really outstanding. You are forcing people to conduct themselves in line with the already utilitarian moral system of the Marxists. So ultimately, utilitarian in the sense that there is just simply a goal which is posited as being of the greatest utility for the survivors of the Marxist system, which is why you have dehumanization in the Marxist doctrine, particularly if you read you get it in Marx in German Ideology when he's talking about how animals preserve things for their young. So ultimately, by intention extension, you can take inheritance and preserving for your young, and then you can take the statement of animals and then transpose it over to humans. So that's why they hate the system of monogamy. So that's the connection between German ideology and some of Engels' writings on the history of the family and consciousness. Of course, you also get dehumanization in Freire. If he's got explicitly the concept of domestication, so the wrong form of logic, the wrong form of morals. They domesticate people into sustaining the old society, and it says that, and he says that there's a choice between to become human. So the precursor to that, or the predicate, is that they are not yet human if they have been domesticated. Being human is overcoming domestication, freeing yourself from the victimhood, the suffering of private property, the wrong form of logic, the existing concepts and ideas and disciplines which are used to technologically advance and help our understanding of the world. Okay. So Engels goes to say that universal love for men is an absurdity, and it's a subtle one, but you can directly position this against Christ. So Young's literal translation of Matthew, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those cursing you, do good to those hating you, and pray for those accusing you falsely and persecuting you. So you can see the complete opposition between Engels and Christ. Engels then states that the alliance of the Magyars and the Austrian Germans was a necessity. All that was still lacking was some great event, a heavy attack on both of them, in order to make this alliance indissoluble. So the Magyars were at the time, nowadays Hungary, and Austrian Germans. So this was when some complementary revolutionary movements were starting to crop up, and they were starting to essentially exert themselves against the existing monarchy or the existing imperia of which they were a part. But Engels is stating something very important here, which is that all that was still lacking was some great event, a heavy attack on both of them. Engels wants them to be attacked, and to be attacked harshly, and to be dealt with harshly, and for many of them to be killed, because ultimately it will make this alliance indissoluble. Once they are brothers in suffering, they become brothers in arms, fighting against a common enemy. So as far as Engels sees it, the revolutionaries need to also create an understanding that the people they're fighting against are counter-revolutionaries, but also through the process of revolutionary action, goad the so-called counter-revolutionaries into acting aggressively against the revolutionaries. Now, ultimately, it's the revolutionaries, as we've seen through basically the history of Marxism and the history of dialectical materialism, like we've seen through the comments of Dodd, Lenin, and Hyde, that you're going to try and create a situation where you're attacked, and you're going to, because you're attacking the people that you're labeling as counter-revolutionaries, you're trying to destroy every aspect of their society, the way they understand the world, their very being. You know, it's incredibly rich to say that this would be something of self-defense. In the Marxist system, you are constantly on the offensive, but part of being constantly on the offensive is to say that you are on the defensive and that the other people are the aggressors. And so you constantly attack them. You say that you're just looking out for the rights of the victims. You goad the people who merely want to defend their way of life into defending themselves. Their defending themselves is positioned as an aggressive action. That's how it goes. So even when communists are destroyed, that's seen as an advantage because it strengthens the movement. Of course, we can recognize that with Hyde and Dodd statements, that it is advantageous for communists to implant themselves in the counter-revolutionary movement in order to either divide it and break it up, to make its ability to defend itself against the revolutionaries less effective, or in order to rattle sabers with the communists over on the other side to foment tension and then to foment conflict. So it depends on, what the communist hierarchy are, deciding needs to be done at the time. But, this is what the morality of Marx, Engels, and Lenin facilitates. Now, you can see these ideas repeat in the work of Marcuse and in Sartre. So Marcuse has his whole system of repressive tolerance, which shorthand is that you tolerate everything which is revolutionary action, irrespective of what it is, irrespective of whether it's legal, and then you refuse to tolerate anything which the people working against you, the counter-revolutionaries, are advocating, so even if it's legal. So this is why you'll get, ultimately, even if free speech is legal, you won't tolerate it. You will force people to suffer the consequences, and that's the repressive tolerance. Yes, there's a law that says you can speak freely, but woe to those who do. So you've got repressive tolerance, which is Marcuse, and again, you can splitting things into the diametrically opposed opposites is very useful. So just consider that any aspect of society as it was, whether it's with capitalism, whether it's with Christianity or the Jewish tradition, so on and so forth, all of these are going to be rejected. They won't be tolerated. Whereas the alternative will be tolerated. And it's simply just a strategy in order to get certain things to occur, or to get people to think in a certain way, to make the social consequences and the consequences to people's jobs so painful that, how can you be in a position where you're stable enough to risk voicing your own opinion? Of course, what that then causes is that people cannot state what reality is, so you can't use truth. Likewise, you're forced to use the dialectical method, so you've got a restriction on your cognition and metacognition. You're then defined ultimately by the revelatory process, but the revelatory process spirals off, becomes detached from reality, and that's where you essentially have your anti-reality, anti-humanism, which is in the dialectical tradition. That's why you have Marx state that the kind of revolutionary he desires is the kind of person who will struggle against the concept of gravity so that they can walk on water. And there again, we have an example of an inversion of the Christian tradition, because ultimately, Christ as God through man comes into the world. It would ultimately be God as Christ who can walk on water, but ultimately no other person can achieve the walking on water. However, in Marx's system, the idea being is if you can simply overcome the idea of gravity, so if you can change your consciousness and then try and put it into action, trying to make it materially manifest, then it would reform being itself to the point of being able to walk on water. And the distinction here is that a human can set themselves against Christ as a gauge and can become akin to Christ, which involves the process of sacrificing the worst aspect of yourself, but ultimately you never become God. That contradiction is not collapsed. That's the prevention of a genuine kind of self-deification. You can't just say, "Oh, I've become more like Christ, therefore I'm God." Whereas in the Marxist tradition, you're obviously doing the opposite. You change your consciousness, you put it into action. Now you're trying to actually seek to do what God did, which is to walk on water. And by doing so, you collapse the contradiction between God and yourself. God is mated with you, and that's where the pantheist is hidden subtly within that system. Again, reading these things can take a bit of time to get your head into, and it might only be after reading a significant number of other books and pieces, or getting key ideas, that you then go back and revisit and look at things through a different lens. I didn't get that the first time I read it, or even the first couple times I read it. I still thought it was bizarre, but it's only now kind of spurred on after one or two of Gramsci's statements that it's like, okay, well now I can conceptualize this in a slightly different way and it makes sense. And then lastly, we have Sartre, once again, very important fellow. His concept of lived experience and what he generated in the critique of dialectical reason is very useful if you want to understand the phenomenology, the lived experience, people's emotions, and the recovery of them embodying the dialectical process. But he stated in an earlier work that violence needed to be redefined. So this is in line with Marcuse's repressive tolerance. Sartre redefines violence as being anything which prevents the revolution. So thereby, what that means is that people who don't accept the dialectical ideas and implement them in their lives, who don't have praxis, they are the ones who are violent. Of course, you can see the direct link back to Engels, which is that with Engels, it's anyone who is not adopting the system is a counter-revolutionary. So here, anyone who's a counter-revolutionary is the one who does violence. Whereas for Sartre, the revolutionaries, they are only ever defending themselves. They're doing good. So that's the mirror politics. You can always find the inversion because they're putting all of the evil onto the other people, reserving all of the good for yourself as a Marxist, and then acting accordingly. So you can always look at these things through the lens of projection and so on and so forth is very useful to understand. Or essentially whatever the Marxist is really advocating or doing, you know, it's almost the opposite is how reality should be, but also reveals their intent and where the action's going to go. These are the works cited. And I hope you've enjoyed this video.